Hey, this is Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. In the last video, we showed you how to disassemble your bottom end, and this video is part 2 of a 3-part series. So if you haven't watched the first video, I would recommend and go ahead and watch that. In this video, we'll cover cleaning and inspecting the bottom end parts, and we'll show you all the critical areas you need to look at to determine what parts you may need to replace. To do this job, we'll need some precision measuring instruments, including a dial indicator, some V-blocks, and a digital caliper. We'll also be using safety glasses, contact cleaner, assembly lube, and don't forget, you'll also need a bearing driver and blindside bearing puller. To start our cleaning process, we'll first remove our dowel pins, and then we'll clean the gasket from the crankcase surface on both crankcases. I'll be putting a rag over the bearings near where I'm working, and that way I don't get gasket material down in the bearings. Be careful to not damage the crankcase sealing surface. To do the final cleaning on the gasket surface, I'll take some Scotch-Brite and contact cleaner and clean it up, and then I'll wipe it down with a rag. This gasket sealing surface needs to be smooth and clean for the gasket to seal properly. If you have any gouges or nicks in it, be sure to address that before you reassemble. Now we'll flip the case half over and do the same thing on the other side. Now move on to the other crankcase half. For this side, we'll remove the O-ring and dowel pin. Our other 2 dowel pins are in the right side engine cover. Now we'll take our right side engine cover and remove the dowel pins and then clean the gasket surface. If the dowel pins are stuck, you can use something that is the same inside diameter and use some pliers to help get it off. Using the punch on the inside diameter will help the dowel keep its shape. Be careful not to squeeze too hard and mark the dowel. Pull the dowel pin for the water pump cover and then clean that surface as well as the clutch cover surface. With this cleaned up, we'll now clean our left side engine cover. With all of our gaskets scraped, we'll now take our clutch cover, water pump cover, and oil filter cover, remove the O-rings, and clean them up to get them ready for reinstallation. What we're trying to do here is remove any old oil or contaminants from the cover. Now this cover is a little bit stained, and that's okay. We'll repeat this process for all of the engine covers and cases. First, we'll go through all of our parts and get them cleaned up, and then we'll inspect them. As you go through your covers, be sure to spray some contact cleaner through any oil passages. When we were cleaning our cam chain, we noticed that we actually have a broken link right here, and luckily our wrench rabbit kit actually came with this, so we will definitely be running the new cam chain. If you're in this far and your cam chain hasn't been replaced recently, it is always a good idea to replace it anyway. Now on these engine cases, you'll normally remove the seals and bearings before you do the final cleaning, but we'll do a preliminary cleaning just to show you how to inspect the bearings if you are reusing those. And keep in mind that we always recommend using new seals anytime this is a part. What's nice about the wrench rabbit kit is that it comes with the common bearings and seals that commonly wear out on your motor. So it takes a lot of the guesswork out, and it will give you confidence that you don't need to resplit your case because of an issue from an old bearing or seal. Now to inspect these bearings, we'll first need to clean them, and then we'll apply some assembly lube. We'll be using compressed air to dry the bearing, but it's very important that you make sure the bearing doesn't spin while you're blowing it with air. and that will keep any additional damage from happening to the bearing. Now we can apply some of the assembly lube. What you're checking for is smooth, quiet operation, and make sure this turns freely. You also inspect this inner race and make sure it doesn't have play from side to side. Now we'll do the same thing on the other bearings. This bearing is really hard to turn, and it's actually binding up a little bit. For the needle bearings, the inspection will be similar. Make sure it rotates freely and smooth, and on these rollers, check for any pitting or excessive wear, flat spots, that type of thing. And keep in mind that this inner bearing race for our crankshaft bearing is actually on the crankshaft, so you'll want to inspect that as well. Now we'll remove the bearings so the case half is ready for final cleaning and inspection. Before we remove the bearings, we'll start by pulling all of the seals. A couple of things I want to point out are that the seal on this side of the case was level with the case. Sometimes, depending on your year, make, and model, the seal can sit slightly below the case surface. So be sure to reference your manual for that. And the other thing, before you start driving out any bearings, be sure to remove all snap rings. The screws for the bearing retainers will be held in place with some Loctite, so we'll heat those up to remove them. To do this, we'll place our case on some wooden blocks, heat these two screws up, and remove them using an impact driver. Be sure the case is clean and dry from any flammable liquids. Now we're ready to remove these bearings, and to do that, we will use a little bit of heat. You can use a hot plate, but we'll actually be using a heat gun. That way we're not getting anything too hot, but we're warming it enough to help get the bearing out. On this bearing, we won't be able to drive it out from the other side, so we'll use a blindside bearing puller. So on this one, our sealed side was facing down, and you'll want to reassemble it in the same way. Next, we'll remove our shift drum bearing. This shift drum bearing is directional, so you'll make sure the manufacturer's markings are facing the inside of the case or facing up. Next, we'll use a bearing driver to remove the crankshaft bearing and countershaft bearing. When we install the new countershaft bearing, be sure to have this stepped edge so that the bearing retainers sit against it. We'll also be using the blindside bearing puller on the counterbalancer bearings. With the bearings out, we can now clean up the case half, and remember to blow this oil jet out with air. Next, we'll use the same procedures on the other crank half. Since we're replacing the bearing, we'll remove the stopper arm. Next, we'll clean our left side engine cover, and then we'll be ready to inspect the rest of the parts. To take the seal out of the left cover, we'll first remove the snap ring and washer, and then we'll remove the seal with a hook tool. Remove the metal washer behind the snap ring with a magnet. Next, we'll remove our oil pressure relief valve by removing the snap ring, and we'll use a small screwdriver and a pick to help pull it out. There's a lot of moving parts in your engine, and there are several different inspections you do need to make. So we'll try to get as straight to the point as possible to help avoid any confusion and not miss any of the most important things you need to be looking for on your transmission or any other parts. If you need more in-depth information on transmissions, we do have a specific video just for that on our YouTube channel. To inspect our transmission shafts, there are a few basic things we need to look at. First, we'll look at these straight cut teeth, and we'll look for any that are broken off or have any damage, chipping, pitting. If they are damaged, you'll want to replace that gear as well as the gear that mates with it on the other shaft. If you've had issues with your transmission jumping out of gear, it's probably these gear dogs right here. The corners round off, and that's something you want to look at. If your bike was jumping out of gear, it can actually bend the shift fork. So you want to inspect these grooves for any galling on the sides. That would indicate a bent shift fork. Our shift forks are in pretty good condition. If they're bent, you'll usually see some wear on this surface here. The only point that should be contacting are the pads. To check if the shaft is bent that the shift fork rides on, a good way is to just slide it through the shift fork, and if it binds at any point, then you know this is bent. The other thing we need to check on these gears is if they're freewheeling gears, move freely and smooth, and then you have your slider gears. You'll make sure these gears slide back and forth smoothly and that the gear dogs catch. So we noticed on our transmission, some of our gear dogs are rounded on the corners, and if there's a slight sign of wear, that's probably okay, but if it's significant wear, you'll definitely want to replace those gears. A lot of times we won't have to disassemble the transmission shafts when we're doing a bottom end, but if you did notice something that's abnormal, or if you've had troubles with your bike jumping out of gear, then you will need to disassemble these shafts and inspect everything more close. So to do that, we will be removing some snap rings, and when you remove those snap rings, that's an item you'll always want to replace. So make sure you get those, and we'll go ahead and show you a little more how to inspect this. It's important to keep all the transmission parts in order, and as we do this, we'll try to lay everything exactly as it came off. So I'll take this off, face it down, take this gear off with it, and face that in the same direction. We'll just make sure we're consistent with everything, and that way it'll help prevent confusion or putting on a gear backwards. Another way you can do this, if you can look at your service manual or print off the microfiche diagram, and if you get something mixed up, that could help you put it back in the right order. Before you remove the snap ring, check to see if it spins independently of the shaft. If it does, there's a good chance you'll need to replace the thrust washer as well. This gear on our countershaft actually won't come off. We've removed our thrust washer and snap ring, and if we look in here, This shaft has gotten hot at some point, and as this gear has spun, it's actually melted the metal of the shaft or this gear, I'm not sure which one, but we can't get it off. So we will actually be replacing the shaft and these gears. Now, I've never seen a gear stuck on here before like this, so it's unlikely that you'll run into an issue like this. But something that is a lot more common is these gear dogs wearing out that we mentioned earlier. Now, what you're looking for is this rounded edge. That is not good. You want them to be square, have a square corner like the opposite side of this gear. So if they are like this, we'll be replacing these. Now, if you have a used dirt bike, it's pretty hard to have a transmission with zero wear. So we'll show you another gear. So this other gear we will be reusing. It's not perfect, but it's about as close to new as we're going to get. Since you already have the bottom end open, if you have any doubts that the gear might not be good, it's always a good idea to play it safe and replace it so you don't have to split the case. Now, all of these inspections go back to what we first said about keeping in mind your original problem. Now, if you had any issues with these gears popping out of gear, definitely inspect those closely, and the ones that were popping out of gear, replace them. Now, the shaft, we'll make sure the splines are in good condition and these bearing surfaces are also in good condition. If you did have any issues when you checked your freewheeling gears, you can actually take a micrometer and measure these and compare it to the manufacturer's specs. As you're inspecting the gears, another thing that's important is measuring the inside diameter of this as well as your bushing. You can measure the inside diameter and outside diameter and compare those measurements to manufacturer specs. The next thing we'll need to do, we can measure the pad thickness on our shift forks, and we'll compare that to spec. Another thing to look for, if you have any wear on the shift fork right here, in this area, that indicates a bent shift fork. So you'll also inspect this pin, and we'll take the drum and check for any wear in the grooves, and specifically, we'll check these ridges and see if they're flattened out. We'll also check the inside diameter of the shift fork, compare that to spec, and you can check these shift fork shafts for any visual damage as well as the correct diameter. Any of these parts that don't pass the inspection will need to be replaced. Next, we'll inspect the crankcase halves for any damage. We'll check the surface area for the gasket. We'll check for any spun bearings in here. Now, if you've had a spun bearing, meaning the outer race is not sitting tight against this case, you can measure this inside diameter and the outside diameter of the new bearing to make sure you'll have an interference fit. If you don't, you'll need to be replacing this crankcase half as well as if it's cracked in any way. If you did happen to have any nicks in this gasket sealing surface, you'll want to get that cleaned up before you put it back together. It's always a good idea to run a tap through the bolt holes on this case half, especially if there was thread lock on there or if the bolt was really hard to remove. So you'll want to do that before you spray everything off because you want to make sure this is clean after you get all that junk out of there. The water pump seals and bearings aren't always replaced when we're in the bottom end. So depending what you're doing, you may need to inspect this bearing, and we'll inspect the bearing the same way we did with the others and check it for smoothness or any play, and it feels pretty smooth. If the water pump seal needed to be replaced, you would notice water exiting this weep hole right here. And again, with our wrench rabbit kit, it actually comes with all this stuff, so we will be replacing it just to be on the safe side. Moving on to the clutch, we'll inspect our clutch basket. So we already mentioned these worn fingers right here where the grooves are worn in. It should be a completely smooth surface so the clutch plates can ride easily in and out on them. We'll also inspect this inside diameter here, check it for any damage. Another thing we'll want to inspect is to make sure the gear is solidly mounted on the basket itself. Now, these have rubber dampers in here, so if you force it, it might move a little bit, but if it has any free play, then you know those are bad and will need to be replaced. We'll also inspect these gears for any damage. The main thing for the clutch hub is to inspect this surface here where the clutch plate rides, as well as for any grooving on the sliding surface where the steel plates ride. Inspect this collar for any damage on the inside diameter as well as the outside diameter. We'll also check the bearing for any flat spots or damaged needles. For the friction plates, we'll measure their thickness with a digital caliper. We'll also check these tabs on the end for any wear. As you can see, these ones actually have quite a bit of wear on them. Sometimes it's real easy to see the damage to these, and other times you will need to measure them. As we mentioned earlier, the steel plates, you'll want to take a surface plate and a feeler gauge, and you'll measure it in several different places around the plate to check for any warpage on the plate. Now, an easier way to tell this, if these plates have any visual damage or bluing, you'll want to replace them. If you've never replaced a clutch before, it can be hard to tell what you're looking for. Now, this isn't the worst steel plate that I've seen. Sometimes it'll be really sharp, dark spots all over. Sometimes there'll be friction material that's stuck to it, believe it or not. But we have this new plate next to it right here. This is how it should look. So you can tell at some point in time this clutch got pretty hot. When you take these clutch plates apart, keep them in order. These steel plates do have a different edge. So there's one edge that has a rounded surface. The opposite side should have a square, sharper surface. And you'll want all of the clutch plates to be installed in the same direction. Next, we'll measure the free length of each spring and compare that to spec. If any are out of spec, replace them as a set. Next, we'll inspect the parts of our shifting mechanism. And how we'll do that is just look for any visual damage to any of the parts and make sure the springs are in good condition. We'll also want to make sure that the shift shaft is straight. And if you have any questions about that, you can roll it on a flat surface and that will help you know if it's bent or not. To inspect the rest of the gears in our bottom end, it will be a similar inspection to what we did with our transmission. We'll check all teeth, sealing surfaces, or anywhere bearings or bushings ride. Next, we'll inspect the one-way valve. To inspect this, we'll make sure the tab sits flat against its seat, and we'll also make sure that this rubber seal is in good condition. To inspect the oil pump, we'll check our oil pump drive shaft, inner and outer rotor, and crankcase bore for any visual damage. As you can see, ours has a lot of pitting on it. We'll definitely be replacing this. Next, we'll install everything into the left crankcase half, and we'll take our tip measurement as well as our side clearance measurement. We'll do that by using a feeler gauge. A couple of other things to keep in mind. You want to make sure the pin that locks our oil pump drive gear in place is in good condition and not bent. When inspecting our Woodruff key, we notice there's a big groove right here in the side of it. This surface should be smooth, and when these are grooved like this, it can actually make your flywheel rotate a little forward and eventually can change your ignition timing. So you want to check for that and prevent any future issues. Next, we'll inspect our cam chain guide for any wear or damage such as grooving, and if it is worn out, we'll replace it. Now, our cam chain tensioner was actually broken, and that may have something to do with the groove that was worn in our guide. Sometimes damage to the crank is obvious and it will definitely need to be replaced. Other times it's not so obvious, and there's several inspections you'll want to make to the crankshaft. So we'll go ahead and do that to ours. We'll start by measuring the radial clearance, and how we'll do that, we've got our crankshaft in a set of V-blocks and we're using a dial indicator. Now our spec for ours is 0.02 of an inch max, and we're using inches just because this dial indicator is set up in inches. To do this, we'll press straight up on the connecting rod and see how far it moves independently of the crankshaft assembly. This lower rod bearing does exceed our service limit, so we will end up replacing this. If that measurement was okay, then you would check the side clearance of your connecting rod by using a feeler gauge and sliding the rod all the way to one side and checking that gap. Next, we'll check the radial runout by using a dial indicator on the ends of the crankshaft. If any of these measurements are out of specification, you'll either need to replace or repair the crankshaft. Now the side of this crankshaft with splines is a little bit harder to measure. Our service manual does want us to check the run out right on these splines, but when you're making this measurement, you'll notice that the dial will drop out in the valleys of the splines. So what you'll be doing is comparing the measurement on the top of the splines. The last thing I want to point out is this style of crankshaft needs to be handled with care. If you drop it, it could be knocked out of alignment. And that's all there is to cleaning and inspecting your bottom end. This is part 2 of a 3-part series. In the next video, we'll be covering assembly of the bottom end. If you need any parts for your machine, check out our website where we have both OEM and aftermarket parts. If you like this video and want to see more like it, subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Charles, thanks for watching.